young chap, non-tobacco, non-smoker, respiratory rate 20, did not had any history of dyspnea, saturation 99%, and chest and that is both RS pulmonary system as well as cardiovascular system on auscultation was grossly unremarkable. As in the emergency, we usually take down few things. That is, one is the RBS, which was normal sugar, and second thing was the ECG. Now, this ECG, it comes directly into our eyes, and as you can see, the heart rate is irregular. So obviously, there is no question of doubt, and it's an atrial fibrillation. But two more things to be observed on this ECG is there is an absence of Q waves in the lateral lead. That is one AVL and V5, V6. And there is an LVH by the voltage criteria in the ECGs. So basically, the Q waves suggest the septal depolarization. And the septal depolarization in the heart occurs from left to right. As a result, there is a small Q waves in the normal ECG in lateral leads, that is one AVL, V5 and V6. Absence of that suggests that there is a pathological LVH. Going ahead with the echo done in the emergency. As you can see, there was a grossly concentric LVH, both in the plaque view and the short axis.
Hello. Sir got disconnected. Just a moment.
Have you summarized? Is the screen visible?
Yeah, sir. Sir, I would request you to go one slide back because you got disconnected. So I think people
I'll
have
do that.
missed. Yeah.
I hope so. We all were together till this ECG findings. Okay. So as you saw the previous ECG, there was LVH, irregular QRS, that is atrial fibrillation, and the absence of Q waves. A patient who is a hypertensive with concentric LVH with the absence of Q waves is a pathological LVH. That means that patient has some underlying subendocardial ischemia, and that patient has uncontrolled hypertension over a long time. So always see for this Q wave in the LVH patients. Going ahead with the echo, as you can see, the echo was also showing concentric LVH with no regional wall motion abnormality. EF was 60%. The importance of concentric LVH in a patient with hypertensive, we'll discuss it shortly. So final diagnosis is young male hypertensive emergencies with a pressure of 210 by 110 and atrial fibrillation. Now, how should I approach this patient? Antiarrhythmics for the atrial fibrillation, correct? Anticoagulation, aggressive medical management for the BP control, and angiography. Is it really required? So the first three is correct. Antiarrhythmics, we usually a young patient, we always try to keep the patient in sinus rhythm as much as possible. With the present treatment like flecainide, amiodarone, sotalol, propafenone, they are very easily converted into sinus rhythm. Especially a patient whose left atrial diameter is less than 4 centimeters, they respond very well to rhythm control. Even if the left atrial size increases up to 4.5 centimeters, we usually admit the patient and do electrical cardioversion or pharmacological cardioversion with ibutamoren, which has a very good efficacy in converting into the sinus rhythm. Second, anticoagulation. One of my most emphasized statement during my all presentations on atrial fibrillation is anticoagulation. You will be surprised to know that even today, 10 to 20% of the patients with atrial fibrillation are not given atrial coagulation. Please understand one thing, antiplatelets has no role in prevention of stroke or thrombosis in patients of atrial fibrillation. Absolutely zero role. It's only and only anticoagulation. Either you give warfarin, acetylene, or any newer oral anticoagulant, but it is a must. Aggressive medical management of BP control. It's a must for a young patient. In elderly above 60 to 70 years, we usually don't go for very strict control, but a pressure less than 140 by 90 is reasonably well. And I'm sure Rumin sir would throw some light on that. But in a patient, young patient like 35, 40 years, a pressure of 120 by 80 is must, and in which diastolic pressure holds more importance rather than systolic blood pressure. Angiography, I don't think so it's required. The hypertension and atrial fibrillation are the main culprits, and even if you do, you will find a normal coronary angiogram. So going ahead with the main topic, as you can all know, hypertension is the most powerful predictor . Am I back?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. I think I was on this slide only.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So hypertension, as you know, almost your 20 to 50% of your patients must be having a hypertension, and it has reached the epic of its competition. It is presently ranked number 1 for the global risk factor for that disability and years of life loss. The disability and years of life loss are the latest parameters used in developed countries to see the effect of a comorbidity in day-to-day life. When you go through the studies, we know that even a small rise of 20 milliliter mercury in systolic blood pressure is associated with intracerebral hemorrhage, subarachnoid hemorrhage, stable angina, and ischemic stroke, whereas weakly with abdominal aorta and TIA. Among the patients with the cardiovascular system, it's a leading risk, almost 70 to 20% of the patients attributed to the hypertension. Or should I say uncontrolled hypertension. Now, how does this affect the heart? It causes a left ventricular hypertrophy because of the increased afterload, and the heart has to work a lot against this increased afterload and the arterial thickness. Due to the long time uncontrolled hypertension, the aorta and its branches become stiff. Because of this stiffness, it causes more pressure on the left ventricle, and it causes more stress on the subendocardial area. And that is the reason patients of the hypertension, they develop diastolic dysfunction. Diastolic dysfunction is still a newer thing which we have just started looking into since last 10 to 15 years, but is often neglected. One of the best treatment of this diastolic dysfunction in a patient with hypertension is just to control the blood pressure and nothing else. It will take care of half of the thing. This diastolic dysfunction is because of the subendocardial ischemia due to the wall stress it creates, and finally leading to microvascular ischemia. So even if you do an angiogram, it will be a normal. This further decreases the pressure on the left atrium dilates, and finally stretching of the pulmonary veins. And this is the endpoint for the atrial, this is the endpoint of hypertension leading to the starting of the atrial fibrillation. The endpoint of one gives the birth to the other. The stretching of pulmonary veins, it causes disruption in the electrical system of the left atrium, and finally atrial fibrillation. Not only atrial fibrillation, myocardial ischemia causes myocardial infarction, diastolic dysfunction causes impaired contractility, impaired LV function filling, and finally arrhythmias. An absence of Q waves, as I already told, is also an indicator for pathological LVH. Usually it's an expensive investigation, but if we start doing cardiac MRI of this LVH patient, we will see the presence of fibrosis in this patient, which is the reason for ventricular fibrillation and ventricular tachycardia. Another subset which we are not going to discuss is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy without obstruction. So they are also a similar thing, and which are mainly controlled by the hypertension control. Coming to the second part of it, atrial fibrillation, most frequent cardiac arrhythmias, and almost 1 to 2% of population affected. It starts affecting almost from the age of 20 to 30 years up to your last day of your life. But if you start screening the patients of more than 75 years, almost 10% of the population is affected. And the worst thing is its effect that is leading to stroke, which is fivefold, heart failure, and death. Now, the heart failure and the atrial fibrillation, they are like hen and the egg. Which comes first is of no importance, but they both are caused by one another and they cause each other. Basically, the left atrial dilatation, fibrosis, electrical issues, atrial stretch causes pulmonary vein firing, abnormal pulmonary vein firing, and after depolarization, which causes increased atrial rate. In an atrial fibrillation, the atrium are actually beating at a rate of 350 to 400. So practically, if you see, they are still, they are fibrillating. They are not causing any mechanical contraction. It's just electrical. So because of that, it is like atrial stunning or standstill. And as a result, the left ventricular filling doesn't occur, left ventricular output decreases. If this AF continues for a long time, left ventricular dysfunction occurs because of tachycardiomyopathy. I would like to share one patient, a lady of around 55, 60 years. Her heart was absolutely, her EF was 15 to 20%, and she had atrial fibrillation. We only controlled the atrial fibrillation. We brought her into sinus rhythm. Her EF increased from 15 to 20% to 50%, 50 within 6 months. That is the magic of controlling atrial fibrillation. Another patient of recurrent heart failure, we kept her on the strong anti-arrhythmic for atrial fibrillation. Patient is not having any heart failure episode since last 1 year. So that is the effect of controlling the atrial fibrillation. So what would happen if these two diodes join in? They are like Gabbar and Shakal. They are strikingly related to excess risk of cardiovascular risk and death. Hypertension alone causes 20% of the atrial fibrillation, and among the patients of atrial fibrillation, almost 3/4 have hypertension as a feature. It is not only a strong factor in remodeling of left ventricular structure, but is also strongly related to left atrial size. As left atrial size increases beyond 4.5, there are high chances of atrial fibrillation. Hypertension causes, as we just discussed, LV wall thickness, stiffness, and diastolic dysfunction, leading to increased LA pressure, wall thickness, and empty fraction. This is because now left atrium has to work against a more pressurized left ventricle. Normal left ventricular pressure against which the left atrium works is hardly 5 to 10 millimeter. But in a patient with hypertension, it has to work against a pressure of 20 to 25, which we call as left ventricular end diastolic pressure, which is one of the very, very, very important parameter to measure in the patient with hypertension if you are going invasive. This leads on to left atrial enlargement and slowly atrial cardiomyopathy and finally atrial fibrillation. In a patient with atrial hypertension, a routine echo, I told you, will see how much difference it creates for its management. There are two patients, one which without a left ventricular LVH and second patient with LVH. Within 10 years, there are almost 2 times the chances of developing atrial fibrillation in a patient with LVH. That is the importance of presence of LVH in a patient with hypertension. LVH in a patient of hypertension mainly points you out the most important thing is it has been uncontrolled. Many of the times we measure the office pressure and we think that it is controlled, but when we see the 24-hour ABPM, we come across that the night taper doesn't occur, the night pressures are still high, or morning surge of hypertension occurs when the pressure goes to 160, 170. So the sequence of events are, both of them has multiple risk factor associated, age, gender, family histories. Nowadays, obesity is another pandemic like Corona, and especially Corona has made everybody sit at home. So I'm sure everybody is going to come with 5 kg more weight when they join, leading to arterial hypertension, activating the multiple systems, that is RAS, sympathetic activation, causing LVH, diastolic dysfunction, and finally AF. And together they cause all the effects: stroke, myocardial infarction, heart failure. One of the important things which will I come at the last end is all AF patients needs anticoagulation, but the reason of bleeding in this patient is not the anticoagulation 50% or 70% of the time. It is the uncontrolled blood pressure in this patient, which is the most important. Now, blood pressure in overall has multiple factors, that is systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, pulse pressure, night tapers, multiple things. But the studies have shown that the pulse pressure is the most important. A pulse pressure of more than 60 gives you chances of developing AF almost 4 times. So they are like double load for the LV. It increases the chances of developing ischemia in almost 2 folds. Coming to the medical management, we have large armamentarium for both hypertension and atrial fibrillation, but how aggressive we should go and whether we should or we must or we should not. This is a research done in 2012, which shows that a tight control, which has been defined a pressure of less than 130 systolic blood pressure, shows a significant decrease of developing atrial fibrillation compared to the usual control which we target of less than 140 by 90. Now, I would suggest that this tight control should be more emphasized in a young and not the elderly. elderly usually, which I define of more than 65 years. So the main armamentarium are the beta blockers, ACE and ARBs, calcium channel blockers, aldactone and eplerenone. The first group of drugs, beta blockers, which are the golden drugs, and as you can see, their effect on the heart is huge. Probably they are among the 3 to 4 golden drugs in the medical history which are shown to decrease death, mortality. There's a lot of effect on coronary heart disease, myocardial ischemia, thrombosis, infarction. Most important is they prevent atrial fibrillation. Let me repeat this statement. Beta blockers have shown to prevent atrial fibrillation. There is a very big myth that amiodarone prevents atrial fibrillation. It cures atrial fibrillation, it converts into sinus rhythm, but it does not prevent atrial fibrillation. Beta blockers are the ones which prevents atrial fibrillation. They cause reverse remodeling and prevents heart failure. Multiple beta blockers are there: atenolol, metoprolol, carvedilol, nebivolol, and bisoprolol. Our mind goes crazy which to start, but I would just like to point 1 or 2 statements on each of them. Atenolol is time tested and probably helps you a lot when you have a hypertensive patient. It's a cheaper drug. Metoprolol is the most studied drug, but when the blood pressure is high, like 160, 170, it's not a good drug to give. A better option would be nebivolol, which has also a nitric oxide stimulant and helps in blood pressure control. Carvedilol is one subset which you should prefer in a patient with heart failure. Another subset is bisoprolol. Bisoprolol is one of the golden drugs which are shown to decrease blood pressure. It's very helpful in patients with heart failure and with a patient with tachycardia. So they are mainly for the rate and rhythm control of AF and best effective when patient has sympathetic overactivity. That is, patient has having increased heart rate and underlying ischemic heart disease. Coming to the second basket of the drugs, that is ACE and ARBs, captopril, enalapril, ramipril, losartan, telmisartan. Basically, the RAS effect in the hypertension, it causes progressive atherosclerosis, interstitial fibrosis, and slowly increased left atrial pressure. This is mainly due to the angiotensin II. As we already discussed, it further leads to ischemia, conduction abnormality, and finally electric remodeling and AF. 90% of the patients should be on RAS, especially patients if they are having blood pressure, kindly prefer ARBs compared to ACE. And if the pressures are remaining normal, 120 to 130, a pressure of then ramipril or enalapril are good enough. So as we discussed, it causes arterial dilatation, decreases afterload, and lower diastolic pressures. The most important effect of the ACE-ARBs is it causes reverse remodeling of LVH. The most commonly used antihypertensives: amlodipine, nifedipine, cilnidipine, benzodiazepine. They are best used in elderly and highly efficacious in controlling BP. Aldactone and eplerenone, they are relatively weak antihypertensives, mainly helpful in resistant hypertension, as it causes they are potassium sparing and helps to keep potassium more than 4. Potassium more than 4.5 in a patient with atrial fibrillation is very important, as it helps to keep the patient in sinus rhythm. Now, I would like to end the presentation with this one last slide. That is, almost all the patients of atrial fibrillation are on oral anticoagulation. Now, many of the time we have to decide whether to start warfarin acetron or a newer oral anticoagulation. This is a recent chart which are showing that if the patient is having two of the above 8 points, then you should consider NOAC rather than vitamin K antagonist like warfarin and acetron. That is this same TTR2 score. It is sex, age, medical history of diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease. Now the twist in this is the hypertension doesn't mean just the presence of hypertension. It means uncontrolled hypertension. The peripheral arterial disease, heart failure, stroke, pulmonary, hepatic or renal disease. Treatment of amiodarone, because amiodarone interacts with warfarin as well as acetron. Tobacco use and non-profession. If the score is more than 2, then kindly prefer a NOAC rather than a vitamin K. Follow-up of the initial case. The patient has presented for last 6 months and presently in sinus rhythm, no history of palpitation, no repeat admission. His pressure is presently 120/70 with patient on bisoprolol and Ramiprid. Thank you very much and wish you a pleasant stress-free Sunday. I'll hand over the screen to Rumin sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mayank Shah, for a wonderful presentation. I now request Dr. Rumin Shah to, throw lights on his topic. It will be a great pleasure to hear from sir.
Actually, sir, under banner of Family Physicians Association Vadodara, it is in 4th time we got an opportunity to welcome Dr. Rumin Shah with this webinar, sir. So,
am I audible? Am I on?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir.
Sure. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to be talking to colleagues after a bad phase of 3 months, unprecedented pandemic of COVID, which has taken a toll on everybody, society, economy, health, etc. So it's better to get connected, get into touch with what is new in hypertension in 2020. Well, this is going to be flow of my talk, the hypertension guidelines, and so on. At each point, I'll discuss what I'm going to be deliberating on.
Yes, well, sir, you are audible.
Epidemiology of hypertension in India. Am I okay? Is it okay? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Hello, hello.
Yes,
yeah. So this is the epidemiology of hypertension in India. Very recent papers. This was in July 2019. Rajiv Gupta and C.S. Venkatraman, two doyens of hypertension therapy in India, telling that prevalence of hypertension in urban India is close to 20 to 60%. So almost, if you see 6 out of 10 patients at a larger estimate would be having hypertension. And if you look at rural India, the same epidemiological studies show that between 7 to now 55% of rural population above the age of 20 would have hypertension. And these are studies from all over India. This shows that hypertension is a major problem, is going to be with us, and we are going to face hypertension in a large quantum. If you were vigilant and not shadowed by a lot of corona studies, this is what came in Times of India somewhere in March, that almost 15.5% school children in Gujarat have hypertension. And this was very alarming. And these are all school children between the age of 9 to 12 years and some up to 15 years. Now, we have seen that there is a high prevalence of hypertension in India. But if you look at data from almost 100 countries, on an average, less than 50% of adults with hypertension receive BP lowering medication. Very few countries performing even worse than that. Some countries are doing better than that. but most of the countries are doing worse than that. That means not even 50% of patients are getting antihypertensive therapy. And mind you, this is despite a well-known fact that a mere difference of 20 millimeter systolic blood pressure and 10 millimeter diastolic blood pressure is associated with a 50% difference in cardiovascular risk in major adverse cardiovascular events. Therefore, on one side, hypertension is rising. On the other hand, our control is not so proper. And three, we are going to face a lot of consequences and morbidities with hypertension. And therefore, it is important that we see these new guidelines of hypertension in a true perspective. These guidelines were published in June 2020 in a very prestigious journal, Hypertension, published by American Heart Association. And believe me, these were, there were, although the lead author is Thomas Unger from Netherlands, Dorairat Prabhakaran from India, and Brian Williams, two giants of hypertension therapy, have contributed to this excellent guideline which has come for management of hypertension. Now, what is the guideline about? They have given great outlook for measurement of blood pressure, including conditions, positions, device, cuff, protocol. As far as blood pressure measurement techniques are concerned, they have given excellent print diagram of how the patient should be seated, what is the cuff size, how should the fit be, how should be the ambience as far as blood pressure measurement is concerned. Mind you, these are very important parameters when you want to measure blood pressure, because one blood pressure measurement is going to change outcome, going to change or put a patient on a long-term treatment. So after mentioning the true methodology of measurement of blood pressure, the authors have now gone to classify blood pressure, and clearly they have not gone for the trap of sprint trial. And clearly now blood pressure is a blood pressure above 140 systolic and 90 diastolic. A blood pressure below 130 and 85 is normal. Between that, that is 130 and 139 systolic, and 85 and 89 is diastolic blood pressure. Now this clears a lot of doubt as to whether we should be very aggressive and trying to control the blood pressure down to 120, or should we be comfortable with the upper range. And now it is very clear that 140 is the cutoff for labeling the patient as a case of hypertension. Now, they have also mentioned and given importance to home blood pressure measurement and ambulatory blood pressure measurement. A home blood pressure measurement of 135 and 85 and ambulatory blood pressure measurement of 130/80 as compared to 140/80 of office blood pressure is supposed to be a cutoff for blood pressure. A very interesting thing that they have done is lifestyle modification. We have been knowing lifestyle modification as a part of hypertension therapy for years together. The first time that in these guidelines there is a recommendation of coffee, green and black tea, and some other beverages, as including beetroot juice and pomegranate juice, as an additional supplement thing for controlling blood pressure as a lifestyle modification. And there is an emphasis on not only aerobic exercise, which have been recommended to all patients, walk, swim, cycle. There is a clear-cut recommendation that patients should also do resistance and strength exercise at least 2 to 3 days per week if the patient is having hypertension. Therefore, the days of just recommending walking as a lifestyle modification for hypertension are gone, and we should always advise patients to at least 2 to 3 days of variety of exercise, like a resistance exercise or a strength exercise. And very surprisingly, but truly, there is an element of atmospheric pollution as a causative agent for blood pressure, and there is a room.
Hello?
There is a suggestion.
Sorry, मैं screen share करी रहा हूँ.
Am I audible, or is there a problem?
Sir, your screen is not visible. Slides are not visible.
Okay.
Sir, you need to share your screen in the.
Okay. None of the slides were seen.
No.
None of the slides were seen. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay.
Sir,
Okay.
the screens are, you have not shared the screen, sir.
Oh.
Sir, on the bottom, there is a green button, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Share
Can I?
screen, sir. Yeah, sir.
Can I?
Yeah.
Yes,
Please.
sir.
Share screen is okay now?
Yeah. No. It's not.
Can I share the screen now?
Yeah,
Yeah, click on this.
you
Okay,
can
okay,
share the screen.
okay, okay. Now, sorry. So none of the slides were seen now so far.
No, sir. No, sir.
Okay, so I'll just have a very quick view of some of the slides. the now are the slides seen now?
No, sir. No.
Now
No.
no.
No, sir. What you can do, you can stop sharing from your this. Again, start sharing. So
Okay, I'm so sorry for the mess up.
no
Okay,
issues. No issues.
share now share. Okay, is
Now it
there?
has
Sir,
started.
it started, sir.
Yeah, now it's visible.
Okay, I'm sorry for that.
It's completely
So
visible, sir.
I'll
Now.
quickly go over to the slides.
Yeah, sir. Please,
Quickly
please.
go over to the slides. This is
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
the flow of the talk that I'm going to give. Hypertension guidelines, as I told you, the epidemiology, 20 to 60% in urban India, 7 to 55% in rural India, and almost a high prevalence of 15.5% hypertension in school children in Gujarat, which came in Times of India somewhere in March, and a poor control of blood pressure in all over world, less than 50% receiving BP lowering medication, and most of the countries doing very poor as far as management of blood pressure is concerned, despite the fact that a 20 to 10 millimeter reduction is considered to be a game changer in management. And these are the guidelines that I discussed. That 2020 International Society of Hypertension Global Guidelines, which were published in June 2020 issue of hypertension. And these are the guidelines or the directions for how the blood pressure should be measured. And this is how they have clearly shown with a diagram as to the posture of the patient, the posture of arm, the blood pressure, the posture of foot also for measuring blood pressure. And this is very important because, as I told you, one level of a blood pressure is going to change the outcome of a patient and aggressive treatment of the patient. And as I told you, the classification clearly says that the blood pressure above 140 is hypertension and below 130 is normal. Between 130 and 140 systolic is borderline and in or high normal, and diastolic 85 to 89 is high normal. Now coming to the office blood pressure, and office blood pressure and ambulatory blood pressure measurement and home blood pressure measurement have been given equal importance. As I told you about the lifestyle modification, the amount coffee, green and tea, aerobic and resistant exercise, and strength training have been recommended as a way of treatment for hypertension. And there is an evidence of air pollution as far as of blood pressure is or control of blood pressure is concerned. Now coming to management of the patient. After this is very important. This is the first time that a guideline mentions something as essential and something as optimal. Optimal, essential is something that has to be done, completely done. Optimal is something which, if possible, should be done. For example, when a patient comes to you, if the blood pressure is 156 and 96, if the patient has high risk like a coronary artery disease or a diabetes or end organ damage, immediately start treatment. That is optimal. But if the patient is not affording or if there are other issues, essential is that you do give the patient advice of lifestyle modification and then go ahead. But if the blood pressure is above 160 and 100, there is absolutely no question but to start aggressive medical management. So this is the first time that they are given advices on the basis of essential and optimal care of the patient. Now, this is a very, very important crucial slide. The management according to International Society of Hypertension guidelines is that step one, always start a dual low dose combination. Very clear. It's the first time that they are mentioning that patient should be put on 2 drugs to start with. It is like managing patient of tuberculosis. You don't start with 1 drug, rifampicin. You always put them on at least 4 drugs. Similarly, a patient of hypertension, when he comes to you, always put them on dual low dose combination, preferably in single pill. So that is what they say. That so step one is dual low dose combination of an angiotensin receptor blocker or ACE inhibitor with calcium channel blocker. Step two is the same drugs but in full dose. So if you have started, for example, telmisartan at 20 milligram, go to almost 80 milligram, and let's say cilindipine at 5 milligram, go up to 20 milligram. Step three is triple combination in which diuretic has to be added. A diuretic, they have clearly mentioned, has to be a thiazide-like drug, not thiazide. And step 4, add spironolactone. Believe me, this is very, and again, there is emphasis on single pill combination therapy. Don't give 3, 4, 5, 6 drugs. Now, very important, consider monotherapy, a single drug is recommended only in low risk patients, grade 1 hypertension or elderly, because you don't want a tremendous fall in blood pressure. And very clearly, they have given beta blockers. They have told that no, beta blockers are to be given only when there is a specific indication like heart failure, like arrhythmia, post-infarct or angina. And therefore, they have said that use free combinations if single pill combinations are not available or unaffordable. We in India are blessed with so many drug combinations that it is always better to put a patient on combination therapy, and our stand of starting a patient on double drug or double combination has been now clearly given a hands up by these authorities. The drug characteristic that they have mentioned is that treatment should be evidence-based in relation to CV outcomes. Preferably, this is very important, use of once a daily regime which provides 24-hour blood pressure control. Treatment should be affordable and cost-effective related to other agents. You can't prescribe a very cost-effective because it's going to be lifelong treatment. Treatment should be well tolerated. We have seen patients coming with cough. We have seen patients coming with edema with calcium channel blocker. And therefore, we need to be very, very vigilant about the side effects, and evidence of benefits of use in ethnicity is very important. So look at the ethnicity and again use that I'll show. And therefore, there are clear-cut guidelines for ethnicity. Since East Asian and Indians have a higher prevalence of stroke, non-ischemic heart failure, a high incidence of morning hypertension, high incidence of nighttime hypertension, and we have a very high risk for cardiovascular and metabolic disorders, we need to be treated very, very aggressively. And therefore, our approach should be very aggressive in managing a patient of hypertension. This is the first time an international guideline is emphasizing on ethnicity and in Indian patients. Now, what is my take on these beautiful guidelines? I've been reviewing guidelines for years together, but this is one guideline which is a gem of a guideline. This is actually the first international guideline. There is a very elaborate guideline as far as how BP should be measured. There is an importance given to home blood pressure and ambulatory blood pressure. Office blood pressure cutoff is 140/90. There is a very clear-cut guideline as far as what is optimal therapy and what is essential therapy. Essential therapy is something on which you should not compromise. Optimal is great if you can manage to get it. There is an emphasis on resistance, high intensity interval training and strength training as a lifestyle modification in hypertension. And most important thing, a dual low dose single pill combination as a therapy to start with. And beta blockers are recommended as last option. There is an emphasis on ethnicity for managing hypertension. Having seen that, now we'll discuss the home and ambulatory blood pressure. There have been good guidelines about measure of blood pressure at home. And now we see a lot of patients coming with their home blood pressure reports, and quite often we are little sort of nihilistic as far as this approach is concerned. Java home BP check kar lo. But now there are clear-cut guidelines that home blood pressure measurement is an adjunct. These are Asian guidelines for hypertension when validated device is used, and this is class 1 recommendation level B. That means that we should encourage patients to have their home blood pressure measurement, and it is now believed that home blood pressure measurement is a better predictor of cardiovascular outcome. So just like we ask the patient to get blood sugar checked, it is equally important to ask them to get a blood pressure monitoring done at home with good validated machine. And we should look for diurnal variation and the ups and downs in blood pressure that we see in patients in office. Now, the guideline, the international guidelines say that when patient has office blood pressure above 130/80, home blood pressure monitoring is requested. And if the blood pressure is above 135/85 at home, the patient goes to the category of uncontrolled hypertension and patient has to be put on antihypertensive medication. If it is not so, if there is a dilemma, ambulatory blood pressure measurement is going to be very important. Now, why is the importance of home blood pressure measurement? It is clearly seen that when a patient comes to you with home blood pressure measurement, the treatment changes and the odds ratio of benefiting patient with home blood pressure measurement is as high as 2% to almost 3 times. That means the cardiovascular outcomes are going to be 3 times better if you ask them to monitor blood pressure at home. Having seen that, now let us go to the topic today, and that is COVID and hypertension. Now, if you look at COVID and hypertension, hypertensives are very high risk group for COVID infection, and a COVID patient having hypertension or even not hypertensive is likely to have multiple cardiovascular manifestations, and therefore managing hypertension in a patient of COVID is going to be very crucial. And a crucial issue is whether patient should be on ACE inhibitors or ARBs when patient has COVID infection. So let's see. A patient having comorbidity, and we know all this, a pulmonary disease like a chronic bronchitis, a COPD, a cardiac disease like a congestive heart failure, a cardiomyopathy, a chronic kidney disease, a diabetic nephropathy, a diabetes and hypertension are the comorbidities which predispose a patient to COVID, and the outcomes of a patient with comorbidity are going to be bad, and they are not going to be as good as in an otherwise normal patient. If you look at the COVID virus, it gets attached to ACE2 receptors with the help of the spike protein. That is what we see here, is helped by TMPRS receptors, and that helps in attaching this SARS COVID virus to cell, and that in turn leads to further invasion of the virus. So if you look at this, the virus has a spike protein, membrane protein, envelope protein, and nucleoprotein. The spike protein gets attached to ACE2 receptor with the help of TMPRS receptor. TMPRS receptor helps in cleavage and therefore attachment of the virus to ACE2 receptors in a cell membrane of an individual, in cell membrane of lungs, and therefore ACE2 receptors have a very critical and crucial role to play in invasion with COVID virus and in propagation of COVID infection. If you look at virus gets attached to ACE2, then there is a replication inside, and then there is a viremia, and therefore the first step when a virus attacks a patient is the attachment to receptor ACE2 receptor. Now, angiotensin 2 receptor is therefore also get replicated when there is COVID infection. If you look at profile of younger patient with COVID infection, they have a high ACE2 levels, but they have lower angiotensin 2 signaling. And when a younger patient gets infected, he doesn't have comorbidity. The ACE2 levels go down and angiotensin 2 signaling goes up. So the incidence of disease is high, but the severity of the disease is low. So there is a higher prevalence but low severity. As compared to that, in an elderly patient, the ACE2 levels would, if they go low, very low, there is exaggerated angiotensin 2 signaling, and there is a lower incidence of disease, but the severity of the disease is very crucial. Thus, it is very clear that ACE2 receptors play a major role in COVID virus infection and in replication. Now, if you look at this, hypertension is a comorbidity. In various studies reported all over, it was seen that hypertension was a comorbidity in almost 6 to 38% of patients of COVID. There were other comorbidities like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, which was seen in between 7 to 16% patients, but hypertension remained a major comorbidity in patients of COVID. And when there was hypertension as a comorbidity, the meta-analysis clearly revealed that the severity would be very high and mortality is also going to be high when a patient has COVID, hypertension, and he gets COVID. What are the mechanisms of COVID and hypertension? The virus binds host receptor ACE2. I'm sorry for that. Just give me another minute. So virus binds host receptor ACE2 to mediate entry into cells. ACE2, the receptor is highly expressed in lungs, heart, and vessels, and therefore the virus effects has greater effect on lungs, heart, and vessels. Now in COVID-19, there is a dysregulation of RAS, renin-angiotensin system, and ACE2 system because of this infection, and therefore in COVID-19, after lung injury, a cardiovascular disease may be a major game changer in outcome, and as is known, thrombosis also is considered to be a major effect of COVID infection. If you look at major mechanism of when there is COVID infection, there is increase in cardiac workload with, for example, in a patient having a borderline congestive heart failure, there is going to be worsening of that. There is a cytokine release storm leading because of imbalance of T cell activation there is a dysregulated or high release of interleukin 6, interleukin 17, and other cytokines which lead to a cytokine storm, which in turn leads to a cardiovascular disease mortality. And thus, immune system activation leads to immune system alterations, plaque instability, and acute coronary events. Thus, a COVID infection by cytokine release storm can lead to plaque instability and acute coronary event. Now, in severe COVID infection, there is associated myocardial damage. There is elevated TROP-T level suggestive of cardiac injury. Cardiac arrhythmia is seen in number of patients of COVID, and there is a long-term severe risk of either having a coronary event or congestive heart failure, and there are going to be effects on lipid and glucose metabolism. So if you look at any viral infection, and more so COVID, there is going to be direct vascular infection, hypercoagulability, which is hypercoagulability is a major complication of COVID infection, and sympathetic stimulation, myocarditis, pro-inflammatory cytokine, cytokine storm, direct myocardial injury, and these all things in a patient of hypertension and COVID will lead to increased event of infarction, a heart failure, and arrhythmias. And therefore, we need to be very careful in managing such patients. So if you look at cardiovascular involvement in COVID-19, there is likely to be plaque instability leading to acute coronary syndrome. There is likely to be myocarditis leading to heart failure. The cytokine storm may also lead to arrhythmia. Cytokine storm can also lead to microvessel injury and microvascular dysfunction. And therefore, the COVID cytokine storm can lead to multiple complications like acute coronary syndrome, heart failure, arrhythmia, and myocarditis. And therefore, it is very important that we manage the patients of COVID, giving equal importance to cardiovascular manifestation. These are, if you look at risk factor of COVID, we know prior cerebrovascular or cardiovascular disease, R and coagulopathy are risk factors, and the manifestations, as we discussed, could be anything between from arrhythmia to cardiogenic shock. So, a study from Wuhan, the genesis of COVID occurred there, in which 416 patients were seen. It was seen that when in 9.7% of patients, it was cardiac injury, 10.6% of patients had coronary artery disease, and cardiovascular disease was seen in 5.3% of patients. Now, if a patient did not have cardiac injury, the outcome from COVID was very good as compared to the patient with cardiac injury, and therefore coexisting cardiac injury, coexisting hypertension, coexisting congestive heart failure or arrhythmia is likely to be a game changer in a patient of COVID infection. What is the role of ACE inhibitors and ARBs and COVID? If you look, this is the standard teaching that we have been told about angiotensin 1 being converted into angiotensin 2 by ACE receptor, ACE enzyme, and angiotensin 2 working at various receptors causing either sodium water retention and causing disease. And if it works on AT2 receptors, there are beneficial effects. Now, ACE inhibitor like ramipril, like lisinopril, like enalapril works at this level, and ARBs work at ARB receptor, AT1 receptor. This is a standard physiological teaching that we have been. Now, in a patient of COVID infection, as we have seen, the virus gets attached to ACE2 receptor, enters the cell, there is a replication, and because of this, there is various manifestations of lung injury, myocardial remodeling, vasoconstriction, vascular permeability. In a younger and healthier individual, there is a good balance of the beneficial effects of RAS and the harmful effects of RAS, the renin-angiotensin system. As the age advances, as the vasculature becomes thick, there is going to be increase in angiotensin 2 activity, angiotensin 1 receptor activity, and there is going to be blood pressure, inflammation, and fibrosis. Now, ACE inhibitors would try to block this and keep the balance on a better side, leading to decrease in blood pressure, decrease in inflammation, and decrease in fibrosis. Now, COVID virus, induce ACE to downregulation. It causes downregulation of ACE2. Could stimulate a shift towards ACE pathway because there is a downregulation of ACE2. There could be a major shift on this. It in turn can lead to acute lung injury and fibrosis and adverse outcome. And that is what was thought, that beneficial things would go down and ACE inhibitors may cause increase in harmful effects. But there is now recent thinking that basically ACE inhibitors and ARBs block this pathway. and shift the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system towards this pathway, the ACE2 pathway and angiotensin 1 to 7 pathway. This in turn leads to acute lung injury and fibrosis. So the previous thinking that ACE inhibitors would cause lung injury is now believed that there is no lung injury. In fact, there is beneficial effect, and there might be decrease in acute lung injury and fibrosis with ACE inhibitor. Now, if you look at hypertension, hypertension is very common in old age, and old age are more susceptible to COVID, and therefore you do see higher patients of COVID and hypertension. And as we discussed, theoretically there is a risk of ACE, but as we seen, so the first paper which came in Lancet Respiratory Medicine 2020 suggested that patients with cardiac disease, hypertension or diabetes who are treated with ACE2 inhibitors or ARBs are at high risk of severe COVID. Why? Infection, and therefore should be monitored for ACE2 modulating medication such as ACE inhibitors or ARBs. That means we should cut down ACE or ARBs, and this was because people believed that ACE inhibitors would cause this, will change the balance, tilt it towards lung injury and fibrosis. But recent literature clearly shows that actually there is a change in pathway, and there is more of angiotensin 1 to 7 and mast cell, and therefore now it is believed that use an ARC, as more hypertensive patients will get COVID, the increase of exposure to ACE and ARB inhibitors to a COVID patient was going to be very high, and it was seen that ACE inhibitor was never a risk factor for COVID-19. In fact, when patients were given ACE inhibitors, there was absolutely no worsening. In fact, there was some improvement when patients were given ACE inhibitors. ARB, it was neutral. So if you look at odds ratio for COVID-19, whether you use single therapy or a combination therapy of ARB with any other drug or ACE inhibitor with any drug, there are absolutely no increased risk to COVID-19 infection. So that belief that you should stop ACE inhibitors and ARB was not valid, and therefore whenever you are giving patients ACE inhibitor or ARB, you should continue that. And therefore, after that Lancet paper, which made people little precautious about the use of ACE inhibitors, European Society of Hypertension gave a guideline immediately that patients with hypertension should apply the same precautions as subjects of the same age category as far as comorbidity is concerned, but they strongly recommended that physicians and patients should continue treatment with their usual antihypertensive therapy, because there is no clinical or scientific evidence to suggest that treatment with ACE inhibitor or ARB should be discontinued because of COVID infection. This was a clear-cut position statement of European Society of Cardiology. Now, and therefore, very clearly, let us be very clear that there is no evidence that ACE inhibitors or ARBs are independently associated with risk of COVID. So, a patient who is taking ACE inhibitor or ARB is not likely to get high incidence of COVID-1. In fact, if a patient has COVID and is on ACE inhibitor or ARB, there is no susceptibility and no mortality, morbidity worsening when the patient is on ARBs, and therefore we should continue them. In fact, in this beautiful, elegant paper written by Dr. Chetan Bhavisi, this has clearly been shown that almost all American College of Cardiology, European Society of Council, European Society Council on Hypertension, European Heart Society, Hypertension Canada, Canadian Cardiovascular Society, International Society of Hypertension, and British Society of Hypertension have clearly written that combination of RAS antagonists should be continued. Please continue treatment with the usual antihypertensive therapy. Treatment with ACE and ARB should be executed. There is no evidence that patients with hypertension or treated with ARB are at high risk of adverse outcomes. Canadians discourage the discontinuation of ACE inhibitors, and International Society of Hypertension clearly said that there is no good evidence to change the use of ACE inhibitors or ARBs, and patients should continue treatment with ACE or ARB. So, almost all major international society, be it American College of Cardiology, European Society of Cardiology, or European Society of Hypertension, and Canadian authorities have clearly mentioned that ACE inhibitors or ARBs, number one, are not associated with a higher incidence of COVID, despite ACE2 involvement in COVID infection. Number one. Number two, if the patient is on ACE2 or ARB, please continue these drugs. And these are very clear-cut guidelines, and therefore a patient of COVID on ACE inhibitors or ARB should not be touched. Let him continue with the same treatment. Now, therefore, continue. What are the guidelines? Continue treatment with anti-hypertensive medications. There is no need to adjust medication or stop ACE inhibitors or ARBs because of COVID, unless hypotension or there is an acute kidney injury. Please don't stop ARBs, ACE inhibitors, and potassium, as is expected in a patient of ARB, should be monitored, because both hypo and hypokalemia is common in COVID-19 and hyperkalemia is common on ARB, and therefore you should monitor both potassium and arrhythmia. So these are very clear guidelines. I'll make very sure that patients' blood pressure medications are not to be touched if the patient of hypertension. Now we are going to have a huge surge of hypertension, asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic COVID patients coming to our OPD after recovery or in the initial phase, and I would not touch their antihypertensive medication if they are on either ARB or ACE inhibitor. Now coming to Azilsartan, the discussion today, all ARBs, if we see, are well tolerated, have placebo-like side effects, there are minimal side effects, and they should be started at maximal approved dose. But is the FDA label same for all of them? Let's see. If you look at Azilsartan, it was the first drug to be initially approved at maximal dose, 80 milligram, the first drug. Most of the ARBs are recommended half the dose to start with. First head-to-head trial comparison was done with 24-hour ABPM and not just ambulatory blood pressure. It was the first drug to be combined with chlorhalidone and not hydrochlorothiazide, which is a gold standard. And if you look at the outcomes, comparing Azilsartan and Ramipril, the gold standard of ACE inhibitor, it was clearly shown that Azilsartan 80 milligram was equally effective with lesser side effects when it was 10 milligram of Azilsartan was compared with 40 milligram of 10 milligram of Ramipril with 40 milligram of Azilsartan. So Azilsartan 40 milligram is clearly equivalent to Ramipril 10 with less side effects, and 80 milligram of Azilsartan is very superior to Ramipril 10 milligram. If you compare Azilsartan with other antihypertensive, existing guys like Olmesartan and Valsartan, it is found out that 40 milligram of Azilsartan is equivalent to almost 320 milligram of Valsartan. And these drugs, Azilsartan 40 and 80 milligram, the red and the green, are having great potency as far as blood pressure reduction is concerned as compared to Valsartan 320 milligram, which is a reasonably higher dose of Valsartan. If you look at 24-hour blood pressure and the change in baseline and change in baseline systolic blood pressure, if you look at in diabetic patients, it was seen that Azilsartan 80 and 40 as compared to Olmesartan did a major reduction in orange and pink, orange and red. As compared to Olmesartan, Azilsartan had a better reduction of blood pressure when it was given at the dose of 40 milligram and 80 milligram to a patient of hypertension as compared to Valsartan. This is Valsartan arm, this is Olmesartan arm, and these are patients who have been compared on ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, not office blood pressure monitoring, clearly showing the superiority of Azilsartan as a therapy versus Olmesartan and Valsartan. If you look at Azilsartan efficacy, after washout of compounds, it is Azilsartan, the round one, which continues to be in blood or with receptors. So the affinity for ARB with Azilsartan is maximum and is long lasting as compared to other drugs like Olmesartan, Telmisartan, Valsartan. And therefore, because of its higher affinity, higher potency, Azilsartan remains a wonderful drug for treatment of hypertension. If you look at Azilsartan potency, there is higher affinity and potent inhibitor effect of Azilsartan as compared to other commonly used ARBs, as we saw in the last slide. If you look at comparison with 80 milligram of Telmisartan, which is the standard drug which we have been using, the blood pressure goal of below 140 systolic or a reduction of 20 millimeter reduction in systolic blood pressure was achieved very well with Azilsartan 80 as compared to Telmisartan 80. Therefore, 80 milligram of Azilsartan is better than 80 milligram of Telmisartan. And clinical experience. in patients has clearly shown that azilsartan is a more potent, stronger, and better molecule to treat, especially when the patients have a higher requirement of antihypertensive medication. And a lot of patients whom I have treated with azilsartan have shown consistency in blood pressure reduction, remarkable reduction in blood pressure, and great potency. So, if you look at azilsartan, it is more effective in lowering BP than other DRBs. It's a potent, having 24-hour efficacy. There is a higher affinity, as we saw in that chart. There is a slower dissociation, so it's a long-lasting association with receptors. There is a more sustainable effect over 24 hours because of longer half-life of 13 hours. There is a high lipophilicity. Most important, there is a reduction in nocturnal blood pressure, which we'll see in the next slide why it is important. The morning surge also goes down remarkably, and this is going to be very, very important because of the next slide that I'm going to show. And therefore, the side effects of azilsartan are virtually same as other, and therefore this remains a wonderful drug, a great drug to treat patients of hypertension. Now, let us see something very important, a new concept of chronobiology of hypertension therapy. What is chronobiology? Chronobiology of hypertension therapy is the treatment of hypertension, and the most important thing, at what time should we be giving antihypertensive drug to a patient of hypertension. And most often our prescriptions mention that take the blood pressure soon after a breakfast at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, or soon after before you go to office, 10 o'clock. There are two landmark papers. One paper was MAP study, which came from Spain, and this was influence of circadian rhythm on hypertension treatment. And there was Hygia chronotherapy trial, again coming from Spain. And the trial was to see the effect of antihypertensive treatment given at bedtime. And these two trials showed that when the blood pressure drug is given at night, all parameters, the systolic blood pressure, the awake systolic blood pressure, the sleep time blood pressure, chronic kidney disease, etc., there is a remarkable improvement when the blood pressure pill is given at night. If you look at adjusted hazard ratio, bedtime medication is a very good medication to prevent ischemic stroke, hemorrhagic stroke, infarction, heart failure, angina, and therefore it is always better to give drug controlling blood pressure, preferably at night. If you look at this CV disease outcome, the mortality and morbidity and CV events, the stroke, etc., there was remarkable improvement when the drug was given at bedtime as compared to when the drug was given at morning. Why? So bedtime drugs, when antihypertensive medication is given at bedtime, there is almost 40 to 49% reduction in stroke, coronary events, cardiac events, and other minor events like TIA. And therefore, a blood pressure pill now has been recommended to be preferably given at night. So in this study, it was shown that bedtime dosing as compared to morning dosing had remarkable better outcome, and the p-value was significantly better in bedtime dosing. Even in diabetics, it is very well known that you ought to give them one drug at night as compared to even other drugs or other timings. And even in non-diabetic patients, bedtime dosing is very, very important. So what does this tell us? The chronobiology, when you use BP control with bedtime treatment, why is it so important? When you give a blood pressure medication at night, there is a significant reduction in BP, which is the night BP, without loss of awake BP lowering. So therefore, when a patient is given blood pressure medication that's at 9 o'clock, the night blood pressure remains very well controlled and morning surge does not occur. There is a greater sleep time BP decline, and there is a significantly lower prevalence of non-dipping. What is non-dipping? Quite a number of patients do not have any reduction of blood pressure at night, which is a normal thing, dipping. When you don't have dipping, there are more chances of you getting a CV stroke. You have more chances of getting a coronary event. So when you don't have dipping, you are called as non-dipper. So when you're giving a drug at night, you take care of that non-dipper. And therefore, it is recommended that at least one of the antihypertensive drug should be given at bedtime. If you give one antihypertensive drug at bedtime, let's say patient is on one calcium channel blocker and an angiotensin receptor blocker. If you give angiotensin receptor blocker at night, there is a 61% reduction in cerebrovascular events, cerebrovascular death, infarction, stroke, and this is 67% reduction in major events as compared to when the drug is given in the morning. Therefore, I humbly request that if the patient is on double drug, give one drug at night. If the patient is on single drug, and if there are no other issues, a blood pressure drug should ideally be given at night. Coming to last two things, new drugs in hypertension. If you have seen that some new drugs are coming up in pipeline to treat blood pressure, a major is ARNI. What is ARNI? ARNI is a combination of angiotensin receptor AR and neprilysin inhibitor. This drug, sacubitril, is a neprilysin inhibitor, and angiotensin receptor blocker is valsartan. The combination of valsartan and sacubitril is used and is a blockbuster treatment of congestive heart failure, and it has changed the outcome of heart failure patients as seen in paradigm trial. But this drug is not routinely used in management of hypertension, but now there is a belief that, and these are various papers, that if you put a patient of hypertension on this combination, the chances of left ventricular remodeling, left ventricular hypertrophy, and left ventricular failure go down. The cost of the drug is prohibitive, but this remains a good drug in future. A second group of drug that is likely to be very useful in management of hypertension is soluble guanylate cyclase stimulator. This is a drug, vericiguat, which stimulates soluble guanylate cyclase receptor, which in turn leads to vasorelaxation and anti-remodeling and reduces the blood pressure. This is the vericiguat is the drug, and it improves endothelial function. It enhances vasodilation. It has major effects on vascular smooth muscle, fibroblast, cardiomyocyte, kidney, adipose tissue, and therefore this is a likely drug for hypertension in future. A third group of drug that is likely to see a great future is a drug known as mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. We have been using spironolactone, we have been using eplerenone in heart failure and as a congestive heart failure treatment, and this is a drug which is not steroidal, it is dihydropyridine. There are three molecules in pipeline: finerenone, azathiorenone, and eplerenone, and these are the drugs which, because of their action of working on mineralocorticoid receptor, improve endothelial function, reduce inflammation, and would be useful tool in management of hypertension. A last but very important group of drug which is likely to come in a big way is centrally acting aminopeptidase A inhibitor. The drug Tribistat has been tried in a lot of patients. This is a drug which works at cerebral level. It works on brain renin-angiotensin system. How does it work? It crosses the blood-brain barrier, works on brain reductases, and stops conversion of angiotensin 2 to angiotensin 3 in brain. It works on this enzyme and blocks this enzyme. This in turn leads to decreases in sympathetic tone, decreases in vascular resistance, improved vasopressin release, and improvement in baroreflex function, leading to decrease in blood pressure. Now, so this drug improves the cardiac function, Tribistat, and after 28 days, it improves the brain RAS activity, which is supposed to be. So we have been so far looking only at peripheral renin-angiotensin system activity. There is somebody who has thought of brain renin-angiotensin system, and there is a hyperactivity of brain renin-angiotensin system in patients of infarct, in patients of congestive heart failure, in patients of hypertension with stress. And this drug will address that issue and control blood pressure. And this drug, Tribistat, also improves baroreflex function, normalizes sympathetic hyperactivity, and improves cardiac function by improving end-diastolic pressure, ejection fraction, cardiac hypertrophy, and cardiac fibrosis. This is the drug working at aminopeptidase A level and improving the blood pressure in a lot of patients. There are 2 trials of this drug which have been done, and the drug holds a great future for management of hypertension, and we see a lot of patients with central and refractory hypertension. This is going to be drug of future. The last 2 slides are on renal denervation. This was a device which came into work maybe 10 years back. It went out of favor because of various reasons. The trials did not show, and now there are 2 major papers which have come in 2020. Renal denervation completely improves 24-hour blood pressure, it improves morning BP surge, and shifts a non-deeper. As I told you, non-deeper is a person who doesn't have deeping of blood pressure to deeper. His blood pressure starts improving at night, and therefore there is a perfect 24-hour control. If you look at renal sympathetic denervation, there is a reduction in 24-hour systolic blood pressure to the tune of 9 millimeter, and there is at the end of 36 months there is a reduction of 32 millimeter systolic blood pressure and 16 millimeter diastolic blood pressure. Therefore, renal sympathetic denervation is going to be a future of treatment with some additions, some deletions, some improvement in therapy. So what are the key points? There are various guidelines, and they say that inhibitors or ARBs, there is no evidence that ARBs or ACE inhibitors have a more chance of leading to COVID-19 infection in a patient of hypertension. In future, it might turn out to be a beneficial treatment in a patient of hypertension. Professional recommendations do not support stopping or changing medications for patients who are currently being treated with ACE inhibitors or ARBs and having COVID. So if your patient has COVID, continue ACE inhibitors or ARBs, and all professional societies recommend that you don't touch the patient. In addition, in fact, if you stop ARBs or ACE inhibitors, there is a likelihood of underlying medical condition, and there is a likelihood of infection. If I have to conclude my talk, there are new guidelines which emphasize that low dose combination therapy as a single pill is going to be the initial therapy and in essential hypertension, and is going to be essential and optimum recommendation for management of hypertension. You go on increasing the dose and make it full if the BP is not controlled. Lifestyle modification, including tea and coffee intake, and different exercise like aerobic, like strength training and resistance exercise are going to be useful tool as lifestyle modification. Home blood pressure measurement is essential now in management of blood pressure. ACE inhibitors and ARBs are useful drugs in hypertension management. Also in patients who have COVID and hypertension, they are not harmful. They do not predispose to COVID, and they should be continued if the patient is on, if a COVID patient is on ACE or ARB, please don't disturb them, continue them with the same medication. Nighttime antihypertensive therapy, the chronobiology, is very effective and good tool in patients of hypertension. Newer drugs, which we discussed, like ARNIs, like Sphyribicet, will change the hypertension outcome, and renal sympathetic denervation will be useful in many cases of hypertension. Pleasure talking to you, and I appreciate your time on a Sunday morning, sparing time for a talk on hypertension. If there are any questions, I'll be pleased to answer. Thank you so much. Any questions, please?
Yes, sir, there is questions.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. There are a few questions in the chat box. I'll read out to you.
Yeah, please. I can't see the chat box.
Yeah, I am just reading out to you. The name of doctor is not there, but how to manage CCB-induced pedal edema? There's one question from doctor.
Calcium channel blocker induced pedal edema is predominantly because of vasodilation. If the incidence is highest with a drug like amlodipine, supposedly it is low with S-chiral form of amlodipine, and supposedly it is low with newer drugs. So number one, if the patient is on amlodipine, I would change him to and try with S-amlodipine. I'm sure it doesn't work. I'm not too sure whether it would work or not. Let me change the wording. I'm not too sure that it will work or not. But if that continues, I would switch over to a newer drug like cilnidipine or benidipine. But believe me, a calcium channel blocker edema, if it occurs in a patient, it is unlikely that it would go away with a newer drug. So the bottom line is that if the patient is not comfortable, change to another group of drug like angiotensin receptor blocker or ACE inhibitor, or add a diuretic.
Yeah, thank you, sir. There is one more question that all patients on telmisartan or olmesartan should be shifted to azilsartan.
Yes. Well, the golden dictum of medicine is that if a patient is comfortable, don't touch him. Don't make an asymptomatic patient more uncomfortable. Let him continue with that. But given a choice, if I have to restart or start a fresh prescription, I would put the patient on azilsartan unquestionably. And there are various, for example, if the patient is on telmisartan, the blood pressure is not very well controlled, I would clearly go for azilsartan, because crudely, although there is no science, there is no data, azilsartan is almost 1.5 times to 2 times more effective than telmisartan in equivalent dose. So for example, a 40 milligram of azilsartan is almost equivalent to 30 milligram of telmisartan, or maybe 20 milligram of telmisartan. There is no data. This is just a practical experience that I am telling.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Dr. Naresh M. Shah has also, while you are talking about the chronobiology of hypertension.
Hello.
Can I come in?
Yes,
Can I speak, please?
please, sir, please.
Yeah, Rumini, excellent talk. In fact,
thank you.
regarding the chronobiology, I'm in the habit of, say, we need 5 milligram of amlodipine. I switch over up to 2.5 in the morning, 2.5 in the evening. And that makes me comfortable, and the patient as well.
Perfect.
And while talking about amlodipine, I would say that if you're having a edema, that means your medicine is working. And
Absolutely.
convince him that this is going to be there, and if you're comfortable with little edema, carry on. The moment you say I'm not comfortable, then you have to switch over to other drugs. Really excellent talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sir, good morning.
Yeah, morning.
Sir, please emphasize more on this exercise. Usually we have seen the persons who are exercising, if they are walking, they are always walking 365 days. They are swimming, they are usually swimming 365 days. You said change of exercise. How it is possible in practical way? Usually it is, so what to do?
Number one, science says that aerobic exercises are the best form of exercise, and so far we used to go by them. Now there are two things. One, body gets accustomed to that exercise, and we need to surprise body. And how can you surprise body? You can surprise it by offering a change in exercise. So for example, if you're walking, go for swimming. But an Australian cardiologist was obsessed with resistance training. Resistance training is the training with elastic bands. It is available as TRX. And he said, and he found himself a great improvement in his blood pressure. This is anecdotal. And therefore, he started recommending this as a treatment modality or as a lifestyle modification. And he did a lot of research. And now it is proven that exercise of stretching or exercise like elastic bands and weight lifting 2 times a week for 20 to 30 minutes will improve your muscle tone, will cut down peripheral vascular resistance, improve the vasculature, and therefore would be very helpful. So if a patient comes to me, I would say that walk for 5 days and 2 days. Either you walk half the time, 15 minutes, and devote another 15 minutes to resistance training or to weightlifting. And this has been shown very clearly to reduce blood pressure. And now American Diabetic Association, American Heart Association, and all other societies recommend a good blend of aerobic with strength training, that is lifting weights, etc., and resistance training, that is bands, etc. So my recommendation would be to go for a change in exercise. One, at least devote 30 minutes a week for both of them.
People are using, say, yoga. This is a hot topic today. People say they don't have more time. Then if they pass the whole time of 1 hour with yoga, which is better to go for the aerobic exercise for the cardiovascular benefit? And yoga, I think yoga doesn't give cardiovascular benefit much. Mental peace is a different part of the treatment also. So what to prefer?
So, agreed. Yoga is excellent as far as stretching is concerned, the Hatha yoga. The other Shavasana, Yoga Nindrasana, and Brahmari are good for mental relaxation. Their role in blood pressure measurement has been dicey. 4 years back, American Heart Association, in a position paper, clearly wrote, American Hypertension Society as well, that yoga is level 2 C indication. That means it is not 100% recommended. Very recently, last year, Mayo Clinic did a study of yoga in hypertension, and it has shown that yoga is helpful in patients of hypertension, especially breathing exercise. So I would recommend yogasan to patients of hypertension, but not as the only way of treatment. They could be used for cooling mind, for stretching. But if a patient, for example, if you have to compare aerobic exercise like walking, swimming, cycling versus yoga, aerobic exercise would certainly be better as far as blood pressure is control is concerned. But yogasan would certainly help if there is stress, cutting down that. And that is not the, so yoga should not be the only way of exercise in a patient of hypertension or diabetes. I don't know, is that okay?
So clearly say it should not be not at the cost of the aerobic. You should go for that.
Not absolutely not at the cost of your aerobic exercise. So you can't do 1 hour yoga and cut it down to 50 minutes and then go for 10 minutes of walking. No, you will not get benefits. No question.
And say there are various things. 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes. Some says if you go for 50 minutes, that is best. Less than 30 minutes, zero. Less than 40 minutes, less useful. So what is ideal?
So ideal walking, as per recommendation of American College of Sports, is that you should be walking for 45 minutes a day. If you want to maintain your health, if you want to improve your health, walk for 1 hour a day. If you want to gain something, walk for 75 minutes or equivalent. Now, if you look at the other aspect, if you want to lose 1 kilo weight, you ought to be spending 7,700 calories. Now that you can burn only if you walk 1 hour a day for at least 5 or 6 days. So an ideal recommendation would be at least 45 minutes of walking or swimming or cycling, either of that.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Bhupendra Chauhan has in fact complimented that, as always, awesome, informative, latest talk. He has asked one question that can Azilsartan combined with metoprolol?
Absolutely, it can be combined. There is no contraindication. It's a good combination, and it would give excellent blood pressure control.
So you have answered all the questions as of now. So I request any other questions.
Any questions? Yeah, please.
Secondly, sir, good morning, sir. Again, what is the recommendation of family physician for the patient of hypertension or diabetes? So the routine investigation like ECG, lipid profile, renal profile, how much once in a year, and what is the ideal way apart from this COVID?
Because there was so much to talk, I did not show the guidelines. But as I told you, there are 2 recommendations in these guidelines. One, as I told you, is optimal, and the second is essential. In essential guidelines, they recommend creatinine, complete blood count, ECG, and a urine routine for proteinuria. In optimal, they recommend complete blood count, lipid profile, creatinine, and if possible, after ECG, obviously, if possible, a 2D echo. Now, in a patient of hypertension, I would recommend that we do creatinine at least once a year, because they are more likely to have metabolic syndrome or diabetes, fasting and post blood sugar at least once a year. A1C would also get creatinine, lipid profile, and A1C every year, ECG every year, depending on the symptoms, echo. Any more question? So I apologize for the time that I took. It was a little longer than what was given to me, some 30 minutes. I crossed it as usual. I can't control timings.
It was a good presentation, sir. Quite informative.
In fact, sir, people love to listen to you. I mean, they are investing their time while listening to you.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
It's a
Thank you.
pleasure to listen to you. In fact, on
Thank you.
behalf of JB Chemicals, I would like to thank you and Dr. Vihang Shah for a wonderful presentation, and all the esteemed participants here who have spent time, invested their time on a Sunday morning. I also would like to thank the entire doctor fraternity for being at forefront of this corona virus fight you are doing, and doing a great service to the society. So once again, we can't thank you enough. Looking forward for more opportunity to be associated with Family Physician Association Baroda, as well as both of the esteemed speakers. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Milan.
So,
Thank
yeah,
you, Atish.
yeah. So with your permission, I am ending the session, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.